Welcome everyone, both here at the Center for Security Policy and our followers online. We're very pleased to have today Elon Carr. He's the Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism at the U.S. Department of State. He has a very distinguished career that includes defending America as a U.S. Army reservist as well. Served our country in Iraq. So we're very pleased to have Elon Carr. I'm also very pleased that this is one of the inaugural events for this new program that we have here at the Center for Security Policy on defending Israel and combating anti-Semitism, which is a growing problem, as we all know. There's this trend that has been identified by various organizations, but it's really been going on much longer than some of the people have noted, perhaps 20, 25 years. And clearly, this rise in anti-Semitism is also convoluted with an anti-Zionist agenda as well, hiding behind it. So it's really a combined phenomenon at this point. And then third, it is really, just as an intro, we consider it here as a threat to the United States and its ideas as well, not only because of the alliance with Israel and the centrality of Israel as part of our Middle East policy and as a nation that shares our values, but moreover, since the beginning of America, Jews have been welcome here. And in fact, even a Zionist outlook was apparent 100 years before President Truman recognized the state of Israel and such insignificant American presidents as Abraham Lincoln and so forth. So there has always been this tie between the United States and its friendly disposition toward the Jewish people. So this rise in anti-Semitism globally, and to some extent here, although we won't cover it as deeply, is threatening the United States as a nation and as how we understood ourselves for many, many years. So you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear the expert on this, Elon Carr. So without much further ado, I give the floor over to you. And thank you everybody for being here.
Well, David, thank you, and Maya, thank you, and thank you to all. Fred, thank you for your leadership as well. David, wonderful introduction, and it's exactly right. The United States, still, even with rising anti-Semitism, which is horrific and which has to be stopped, is still the most philo-Semitic country in the history of the world. And how lucky we are that the United States is now led by the most philo-Semitic administration in the history of the country. When you look at what the president has done, whether it's President Trump, Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, my boss, Secretary Pompeo, or the administration at large, there has been an unprecedented commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, to protecting the Jewish people throughout the world, and to supporting the State of Israel. President Trump, whenever he speaks about anti-Semitism, always refers to it as the vile poison of anti-Semitism. And that's a very apt description, because, David, you're exactly right. Anti-Semitism isn't only about the Jews. And the mission of fighting anti-Semitism isn't only about protecting Jews, although certainly if that were all, that would be a sufficient reason to do it, morally, but it's not. Anti-Semitism is a vile poison because it is human history's greatest barometer of suffering. And every society that has imbibed this vile poison has rotted to its core and produced human suffering at a level that defies description. That's the history of this ancient, relentless, insatiable evil. It's really one of the oldest human pathologies. And so in combating it, we are really fighting for the values on which our great country was built. And frankly, the values on which every decent, just society in the world has been built. And that's why this is so critically important. David, 1 year ago, really 1 year and a month ago, I mean, my anniversary almost, I was appointed by President Trump and Secretary Pompeo to lead America's fight against this sickness that is anti-Semitism. And I took this appointment at a time of rising anti-Semitism throughout the world. It is unthinkable that 75 years after the Nazi crematoria stopped operating, and we just commemorated the 75th year of the liberation of Auschwitz, 75 years later, that Jew hatred would be on the rise in Europe, of all places, and even in America. Like I said, the most philo-Semitic country ever, it still is, but Jew hatred is on the rise here too. It is unthinkable. And so, the question is why? What is going on? What is the source of this? The source of the rise of anti-Semitism today are three. There are ethnic supremacists of the far right, Israel haters and anti-Zionists of the radical left, and militant Islamists. These are the three sources of anti-Semitism today. And if one thinks about it, it's remarkable because these three ideological camps have really nothing in common. One would think that they would hate each other more than they hate anything else on earth. And yet they're united by their hatred of the Jewish people. And again, I would argue, united also by the fundamental incompatibility of their values with everything on which our country was based. And so what are we doing about it? Well, several things. First of all, security. If one does not have security, one doesn't have quality of life. If you can't leave your home and know that you're safe, put your kids on a school bus and know that they're going to come home in one piece, you cannot live that way. And so job one is security. One of my chief asks overseas is that a country supplement and help secure Jewish community assets and Jewish communities so that Jews feel safe. That's job one, and I would argue the primary, most fundamental responsibility every sovereign has to that sovereign's citizenry. Second of all, the internet. Look, the internet and social media has been a source of such good and has changed our lives for the better in so many ways. But we have to be honest. The internet and social media is the chief vector of this hatred today. And not only of anti-Semitism, of all kinds of social sicknesses. We've got to deal with it. Now, America doesn't believe in censorship, thank God. We will not constrain the First Amendment. But there are other things that we can do. First of all, not all speech is protected. The moment that hate speech crosses the line into incitement, it's no longer constitutionally protected, and the government has to be ready to act against incitement to violence. Second of all, just because something is constitutionally protected doesn't mean it can't be condemned. And here, you hear the anti-Semites, every time you try to call what they're saying anti-Semitism, they'll say, well, I have a First Amendment right. That's irrelevant. You might have a First Amendment right to say it. Nobody has a First Amendment right to be free from condemnation. And so we have to meet despicable hate speech, even when it's protected, with forceful, unequivocal condemnation. Also, internet platforms should enforce their own terms of use. They have terms of use that prohibit this sort of thing. They should be encouraged to enforce that. So the second priority we have is dealing with hate on the internet. Look, those of us who are parents, we would never think to allow our children to wander unescorted, or even escorted for that matter, in neighborhoods of crime and of violence and hatred and drugs. And yet, every day, America's children and the world's children are wandering just in such neighborhoods, virtually. And alienated teenagers who are angry and trying to find themselves are sucked into a vortex of hatred where they feed ever deeper in the dark web off of the most despicable hatred, and they become radicalized. And then a portion of those turn to violence. This is something that has to be dealt with. The third priority we're working on is education. And this is a key point. First of all, there are countries today that are still indoctrinating children to hate Jews. That has got to stop. And we are making the case that that has to stop. But second of all, we have to do a better job. All of our societies, the United States too, but certainly every country in the world, to educate our kids not only about anti-Semitism and about the Holocaust, that's certainly critical, but we have to educate our kids in philo-Semitism so that every kid in every classroom knows about the profound and beautiful and inextricable contributions the Jewish community has made to our countries writ large. I mean, can you tell the history of the United States, or of France, or of England, or of Germany, or Poland, Hungary, Russia, without talking about Jewish history? Germany, next year in 2021, will commemorate, you ready for this? 1,700 years of Jewish history in Germany. So I was just in Germany, and I asked the question, well, okay, that's great. What are you doing about it? What curriculum are you formulating so that every kid in every classroom in Germany knows about the incredible Jewish history in Germany? So it's not enough to educate in anti-Semitism. You have to educate, you have to give a philo-Semitic education. And then lastly, let me talk about, lastly, a very important source of violence and anti-Semitism in the world today, and that is militant Islam. I'll tell you a personal story. When my mother was a young girl, there was a knock at the door. We come from Iraq, my family. Very old Jewish community from the time of the Babylonian captivity, 2,500 years. There was a knock at the door, and my grandfather, her father, had shaving cream on his face. It was early in the morning. He answered the door, and it was Iraqi soldiers who dragged him away. He was paraded through the streets in leg irons, like a slave, together with Jews from the community that they had rounded up, and they threw him in prison. And my mother, as a young girl, would visit her father in prison until he finally said, "Flee. Don't wait for me. Leave." And so my grandmother, my mother, who was a young girl, and my uncle, who was a toddler at the time, without their father, who was in prison, fled across the border and escaped to freedom. Now, I tell that story because really there is a tale of two Middle Easts. There's a tale of two Islams. The Islam of Jew hatred and radicalization, but also the other side of Islam. To what country did my family escape? My family escaped to Iran, where a Muslim leader, the Shah of Iran, who was not only pro-Western and pro-American, but overtly philo-Semitic, was giving Jews asylum. My family was rescued by a Muslim leader in the Middle East. Today, in my role as special envoy, I am working with Arab countries who now are not only changing their curricula and re-exploring Islam's approach to Jews and Christians, but also engaging currently in what we are seeing, a rapprochement with the State of Israel. It's a remarkable time. And here in the United States, I work with Muslim organizations all the time that are moderate, that are patriotic. Some of them are led by U.S. military officers and war veterans who are proud Americans and Muslims. And they are philo-Semitic and they are pro-Israel. And so it is critical that the way to beat this malignant militancy within Islam is not only not to paint all Muslims in the same brush, but to empower, to fight for, and to stand together shoulder to shoulder with those moderate Muslims that are doing God's work. I'll give you an example from France. I just returned from France. Several Muslim leaders in the south of France have asked the French government to deport other Muslim leaders, including some imams, because they were radicalizing French Muslim kids. This is a tremendous win, and that's what we're seeing. And so all of us who are doing this work have to stand together to empower the moderate Muslims who want to turn a new page and end this. I know that if we work together with our friends and allies around the world, we will roll this back. In the words of Lord Eric Pickles, one of my great friends and partners who is doing great work in the United Kingdom, he said, if all we do is contain anti-Semitism, we failed. It's not enough. We have to roll it back. Thank God there are leaders like him and John Mann in the UK, like Frédéric Poitier in France, like Georgiev in Bulgaria, and so many others, Katerina von Schnurbein, the EU anti-Semitism coordinator, Felix Klein in Germany. The list goes on. These are great leaders who are our partners in this fight, and they get it. And I know, working shoulder to shoulder with them and other great organizations that are doing such important work, we will fight this, we will roll this evil back, and we will deliver to our children and grandchildren that better, decent future that they so richly deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elon. I really appreciate that. Excellent, excellent, excellent. I want to, in a second, give Maya Carlin, who's an analyst here at the Center for Security Policy, a moment to say a word or two and to ask a question. I do want to make one or two observations. First of all, I agree with everything you've said. It's very important. One of the areas that I'm worried about is the creeping entry into institutions of Europe. Perhaps here, maybe too, but more in Europe, of some tolerance for the anti-Semitic wave that's happening. I'll give two examples. The courts in Europe. There was the Sarah Halimi case, a woman who was murdered and then defenestrated, by a terrorist, essentially, who cited Quranic verses while killing her, throwing her out the window. And the courts in Europe, in France, here in this case, basically dismissed it as insanity. The second case was before that, actually. It was the burning of a synagogue in Wuppertal, in Germany, 2014, during the Gaza conflict. The case was thrown out of court as essentially the three defendants were dismissed. It was dismissed against them, or suspended against, sentences were suspended, essentially because it was seen as an act of political expression and critique of Israeli policies. This is a synagogue that had been burned in Kristallnacht and only a few decades ago had to be rebuilt because of that. So you see in the courts in Europe this creeping tolerance that really is to some extent also reflective of some policies in the European Union, which is they hate Israel, but you can kind of understand their hatred of Jews because of Israel and stuff. And to me, it undercuts the moderate Muslims who are trying to fight this, because it validates those who are more radical.
You're exactly right.
So, one, I think that there is this growing problem of creeping tolerance of anti-Semitism by institutions, even in the West. And then the second thing that worries me is, of course, the United Nations. Just today, ironically, as we have this panel, they passed in the UN Human Rights Council, they voted to blacklist Jewish companies that are doing business in the territories. 112 of them, according to the announcement, 94 in the report. But at the same time, the Israelis announced in their upcoming budget that they're cutting by 60% their office that combats BDS. So what this leads me to wonder is, when I was in the Bush administration, we had quarterly coordination meetings with the Israelis, but also with Britain, with Germany, France, to deal with the proliferation threat. Of course, the big one at that time and now was Iran, because this was seen as such a threat to us and our key ally, and Israel and other key allies, Saudi Arabia and so forth, that it warranted a quarterly coordination meeting at the highest levels. In our case, it was with the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Department of Defense had parallel meetings, strategic planning meetings, with Israelis and the British and so forth. I'm wondering whether or not, given the rise of anti-Semitism and how this is really a new form of threatening existentially our ally, but also eroding and destroying the values upon which our nation is built, whether there might not be a real need to institutionalize formal coordination structures between our government, the Israeli government, the British government, German government, and so forth, to address some of these issues, because I'm sure they're worried about this as well. So, without going too far, I wanted to throw a few of those ideas out.
Yeah. So first of all, on coordination, absolutely, 100%. It is needed, and we do it every day. My role actually is to help facilitate precisely that coordination. Let me give you some examples, specifically on the issues you talked about, because you raised the issue of hate crimes in courts, right? Mm-hmm. I just returned not too long ago from Germany, where I met with senior law enforcement and prosecution leaders, so justice and interior ministry people from 7 separate German states, 7 states. And we had joint programming specifically in the subject of investigating, prosecuting, and appropriately punishing hate crime. In France now, thanks to the work of not only the French government, but the anti-Semitism coordinators, in every single police academy in the country in France, and in every single prosecutor academy, where not only prosecutors come from, but judges as well. There is now specific training modules on hate crimes and anti-Semitism, in all of them in the country. So this is precisely an example of the kind of fruits that coordination can produce. The problem in France and Germany is that judges in France and in Germany, and because I asked this very question and I raised the issues of these appalling miscarriages of justice that you just pointed to, is that judges don't have continuing judicial education obligations like our judges do. And so it's very difficult to inject into the judiciary training that brings them up to speed on current events. Furthermore, judges tend to come from academia in these countries. And even though they go through the prosecution academy, they weren't all prosecutors. So there's a kind of an academic detachment. And by the way, I'll get to that in a minute. But there's this kind of academic detachment from what anti-Semitism is today and why anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. By the way, I'm so proud that my boss, Secretary Pompeo, stood before 18,000 activists at the AIPAC Policy Conference, and he said, let me go on the record, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Think of the contrast. It's not saying only, don't blame Jews for Israel, right? This idea of the burning of the synagogue, right? Well, it's because of Gaza, and maybe he shouldn't have taken it out on the Jewish community. Well, first of all, yes, you can't blame one Jew for the conduct of another Jew at any time. That's certainly anti-Semitism. But more than that, hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. It's plain and simple. You can't hate the Jewish state and pretend that, that one is not trafficking in anti-Semitism. And our Secretary of State said it. That's my marching orders. That's the policy of the United States. And I'm so proud of that. So coordination, yes, we're working on these issues in the context of law enforcement. We're working on these issues in the context of internet hate and the proliferation of hatred on social media and the internet. It's a constant effort to fight this. I will also, since we're live here, I want to thank President Macron for condemning the Halimi decision. When he said this is a miscarriage of justice. When the president of a country says that's very powerful. And things aren't perfect in France. We need to do more work. By the way, things aren't perfect here either. But I really, we have to give credit where credit is due, and when they do the right thing, such as institute these training programs, we have to recognize it and give credit. Now, a word about this academic detachment I talked about before.
The academia is
So,
another issue.
What's going on university campuses throughout the world, certainly here in the United States, but it's also it's the same in Europe. I mean, I meet with student leaders. I've met with the national Jewish student leaders in France and in the UK, and I meet with student leaders throughout the United States all the time. What is happening on far too many campuses is that anti-Semitism is trafficked in the open. It is repackaged and rebranded as hatred of Zionism and the state of Israel. Jewish students are harassed and marginalized. Their safety is threatened. I was told by Jewish student leaders in Europe that the price for being safe as a student, the cost of that safety, is a total detachment from Zionism and the state of Israel. You want to be safe, you have to check your Zionism at the door. You can't mention the Z word. You can't have any affiliation with the state of Israel. You know what the word for that is? Anti-Semitism. That's the word for that. You can't tell a Jew that you want to be safe. You can't practice some aspect of your identity. You can't have any connection to Shabbat or Yom Kippur or Passover or Israel or Zionism or Jewish history or the eternal connection of the Jewish people to their ancient homeland. You cannot do that. That is anti-Semitism. And how lucky we are and how proud every American should be that the President of the United States in December signed an executive order that says enough is enough. No longer will we tolerate harassment, discrimination, marginalization of Jewish students on campus. And when he signed that order, I was at the White House when the President signed that order, he looked at the camera and he said, let me make this clear. If a university that allows discrimination and harassment of their Jewish students is going to lose a lot of money. This is going to be very expensive for you. I mean, he looked at the camera and he said that. And so we are doing something about this. This is, I will tell you, this is a priority for me and my work. And the reason why is because these students on campuses today, these are the future leaders of our countries, of the United States and of Europe. They're the leaders of the corporate world, of civic society, and of government. And to allow anti-Semitism to be trafficked in a way that would lead to the discrimination or harassment of Jewish students is absolutely an outrage and has to be stopped. And thank goodness, again, this administration is on the record and committed to stopping it. One more example of the unprecedented commitment of President Trump and the entire team, including Secretary Pompeo, to this urgent cause.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can't emphasize that enough. Maya, did you want to? Maya works here as an analyst at the Center for Security Policy. She's also a master's degree student at the IDC in Herzliya in Israel.
I know the campus well.
It's a great campus. Well, thank you so much for your remarks. I also just want to say I'm thankful for that recent executive order because as a recent graduate from a small liberal arts college in Los Angeles, I experienced that all the time, just BDS students screaming awful things about Israel, kind of laced in anti-Semitism.
One of the Claremont colleges?
Occidental College. Yeah.
Not too far from there, in the Claremont colleges, there was actually vandalism where mezuzot were ripped off the door of Jewish students. I mean, it's unbelievable what's going on.
It's unbelievable, and I'm glad it's being addressed finally in this administration. I did want to go back to your initial point about the rise of anti-Semitism in the UK specifically. I mean, of course, it's on the rise globally, but in the last year, incidents in the UK have gone up 10%, so I think it's important to focus on that. I wanted to hear your opinion of, do you think the Labour Party's anti-Semitic crisis contributed to the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn back in December, and now the election?
I can't think of a bigger win than the fact that anti-Semitism in the UK became a campaign issue. I mean, this is extraordinary, where you have Prime Minister May and then Prime Minister Johnson overtly saying anti-Semitism will never find quarter in our country. This is contrary to our values. What a tremendous thing that is. And then you asked if I think anti-Semitism in the Labour Party had something to do with its defeat. Well, I don't have to speculate because the polls show that it had everything to do with their defeat. There were other issues too, but how remarkable is it that ordinary Brits in the polls, one of the reasons for their vote for the Conservative Party was their offense at the anti-Semitism of Labour. When you have, ordinary citizens who are not Jewish saying, this is not the country I want. These are not the values that my country supports. You cannot imagine a bigger win than that. This is a tremendous, tremendous victory for philo-Semitism. And so, first of all, hats off to British voters, but also, I think the lesson from that is when you look at that result, you have to ask, okay, but what happened before the election? And what happened before the election is that the Jewish community of the United Kingdom stood united. They put aside their differences. Look, political differences, there are political differences there are political differences here, but at a time of real crisis, of an existential threat, as they saw it, they put aside all differences. And they stood together and they said, enough is enough. In fact, enough is enough with the title of the rally that they held. Enough is enough. The chief rabbi of England stood up and said, this is unacceptable. I mean, the cadre of leaders of the Labour Party are a threat to the Jewish people. The three competing Jewish newspapers in London printed a joint editorial on the front page, remarkable for being on the front page and remarkable for being joint. It was under the banner headline, United We Stand, signed by 3 editorial boards. Exactly the same front page of 3 different papers. And it's basically said, Jeremy Corbyn is a threat to our survival. If that hadn't happened, Brits would not have reacted that way. So I think the lesson is, in these hyper-partisan times we're in here in this country, is, there are times when we just have to put aside all political differences and stand together shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, like the UK community stood and said, enough is enough. We will not tolerate this. And by the way, that goes for the malignancy on the far right, the malignancy on the far left. Look, As I say it, we don't rank or prefer or minimize any of the sources of anti-Semitism. Jew hatred is Jew hatred. What do we care what ideological clothing it wears? If it's Jew hatred, we have to fight it. And not to fight all of it is to really basically not to fight any of it. If you leave 2/3 or 1/3 of a tumor untreated, the patient doesn't do well. And so if you're serious about the fight against anti-Semitism, you have to fight it when it comes from the ethnic supremacist far right, you have to fight it when it comes from the radical anti-Zionist left, and you have to fight it when it comes from militant Islam. And that's the key, putting aside differences and standing together in this urgent and critical mission. And when you see the upside, the results that kind of unity brought about in the UK, what a beacon that is to the world, that we can beat this, but we have to do the right thing.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I actually think the whole left-right Islamist equation, it's actually very interesting in precisely the fact that it's not only that all three are a threat, but that we're seeing increasing cooperation among all three. They're not separate anymore. You don't need to go further than are there and various Islamists funding to Europe and adhere toward organizations that are on the right, on the left, BDS, anti-Semitic on the right. You see the growing interaction between these. So it isn't really a separate phenomenon, and it can't be dealt with unless, as you said, there's sort of a enough is enough attitude among the Jewish leadership, among the non-Jewish leadership, to say, no, this is all, we're not going to say that's your problem, not ours, because these are leftists, so that's that party, and these are rightists, so that's that party. It's a unified threat, so therefore the response has to be equally unified.
The cooperation between them is it's a despicable alliance, and it's also bizarre. I mean, we're even seeing on the campuses of all places, where you think, well, it's the sort of tyranny of the left on some campuses, right? What we're seeing now is that far-right groups, neo-Nazi-like groups, have learned that if they talk not about Jews but about Israel and Zionism, suddenly they have a safe space. And so now we're seeing groups on the far right adopt the language of the left. We saw this in Germany, where they, Israel is our misfortune was one neo-Nazi group chanted. We're seeing this now in the United States. And the left is responding, right? The far radical left is responding with tolerance to the crazy neo-Nazi right, as long as it stays within the confines of anti-Zionism and Israel hatred. It's an appalling alliance, and that's why we really have to make no distinction. We have to fight all of it. If it's Jew hatred, it's Jew hatred, and we've got to confront all of it.
Yeah, and also the criticism of Israel. I mean, of course, it's legitimate to criticize a foreign country.
No question.
And we all agree with
Criticize
that.
any country.
And
of course.
Many people who know me know I've had my share of criticisms often of Israel too, and it's what it does. Maybe not from the same direction as many people, but still. But that said, one definition. I mean, the administration, by the way, has also done good work on the definition of anti-Semitism. But one definition that's been out there very many years is just simply holding Jews to a different standard than other people, that you wouldn't hold yourself or others like you to that standard. And it seems to me that a good bit of the criticism of Israel is exactly when one can criticize Israel, but one has to then really contemplate the standard you're using in criticizing Israel. Do you criticize it in the same way you would criticize, for example, England or ourselves or others, let alone Russia, China, or whoever else? And then the second thing is, of course, the invention of accusations, the invention of crimes that are not verifiable or simply didn't even exist. That these are, again, how one separates critique of Israel from anti-Semitic attack on Israel, or using Israel as a cover for anti-Semitic attack. Maya, did you have another?
Well, I just want to jump in on that and say, David, you're 100% correct, and that's why referring to an objective definition of anti-Semitism is so important.
Yeah.
One of my chief asks when I go overseas, representing the United States on this issue, is that a country that has not adopted this standard definition, this is the definition put forth by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a multilateral entity of which the United States is a part. It is the accepted standard definition of anti-Semitism. It has broad-based support. To give you an idea of how broad, the OSCE, the 57-country East-West organization, voted to adopt it 56-1.
Wow.
So that's pretty good. I mean, that's broad-based support. The State Department has been using it for a while, and now, with the President's recent executive order, that is the definition that is adopted now by the federal government, by the administration, for the interagency. And the importance of this definition is that, in addition to simply defining, anti-Semitism as hatred of Jews, I mean, that's right, but there are 11 contemporary examples of anti-Semitism that are part of the definition, plus sort of a 12th catch-all. And they include not only classical, the blood libels and all of the kind of medieval type of anti-Semitism you'd expect, but it also makes very clear that targeting the Jewish collective, targeting the state of Israel, or Zionism, is anti-Semitism. And so targeting the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collective, given explicitly as an example of anti-Semitism. Comparing Israel to the Nazis, anti-Semitism. Denying the Jewish people's self-determination by claiming that the founding of Israel is a racist endeavor, an example of anti-Semitism. And, David, as you said, subjecting the Jewish people or the state of Israel to a double standard not applied to any other democracy is an example of anti-Semitism. And so that's why this definition is so important, which is why, by the way, organizations that openly traffic in anti-Semitism, like JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, consistently oppose the adoption of this definition everywhere. Because they understand that what they're saying meets the definition of anti-Semitism, and they don't want to be called anti-Semites. Well, you know what? Like I said, nobody has a First Amendment right to be free of condemnation. You might have a right to say despicable things, but the rest of society has every right to call it out for what it is.
Yes.
And that's why this definition, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, is so important. And like I said, it's one of my chief asks when I go overseas. More and more countries have lined up to adopt it.
Yeah. Maya, you had another point too you wanted to raise.
Sure, yeah, this kind of goes back to your third point in your three-point system of education. And you touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you had any other recommendations for how to tackle the issue of disengagement when it comes to Jewish youth and the level of assimilation in youth from Jewish core values and its association with Israel.
Well, I think that, that's an age-old question that can apply to the Jewish community or to any community. How do you inculcate the values? And we ask this about sort of the American ethic and the ethos of our country, right? The principles on which our country was built and founded. Are we doing as good a job as we could be inculcating those values in our young people? Do young Americans today get the same sense of constitutional structure, of civics, the American, that American ethos? I think we all see that there's really an attenuation of that. And it's also true in the Jewish community. I mean, I think we really, the first place I visited in my current role, a year ago now, when Secretary Pompeo announced my appointment, I was on a plane at Dulles Airport taxiing to go to Europe to represent the United States. So I hit the ground running, literally. And there at a conference, a wonderful Dr. Williams of the Holocaust Center, the Holocaust Memorial Museum Council, said that, in addition to when we talk about educating about anti-Semitism and so on, he said, we also have to think of more broadly, a values-based education. Because anti-Semitism really it's a spiritual sickness. That's what it is. It's a spiritual sickness. And I always say that we have to fight the manifestations of anti-Semitism, but in order to win the war, not just win individual battles, strategically to win the war, you have to fight the thing itself. And the thing itself, apart from the manifestations, the violence, and the hate speech, and the rallies, the attack, but to fight the thing itself, you have to fight the idea and the worldview, and that requires values-based education. And so I think you're exactly right. I mean, there is that kind of an attenuation of that. We see it in the Jewish community, but we see it really in almost every community. And I think all of us as Americans, and all of us as parents, need to think long and hard about how we want to raise our kids and what kind of education we think they need to have in order to be productive members of whatever community they're a part, but ultimately productive citizens of the United States who understand, the values and the principles and the ideas that were absolutely essential to our success, without which America wouldn't be America. My God, if we lose that, God forbid, should we forget those. And so this is really the time to re-examine that connection to our deep values.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a very good way to begin to wrap it up. It's again goes back to the word vile poison that the president uses.
So true.
Poison being the threat, and vile being the values, the violation of values that's embedded in that. And going back then to the Mayflower and to the original American emigres who saw this as the New Jerusalem and the anchoring to the values that founded this republic. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And
I enjoyed
it's
it.
wonderful, and we wish you the best
Thank you.
in your accomplishing this
Thank
very
you.
important task. And thank you everybody for joining us here at the Center for Security Policy, and look forward to many further discussions on this.
Thank you.